Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel, which is entitled Lessons Learned on Building Effective WPS NAPs. We've heard a little bit about that already, as we've just heard, and we're going to pursue a little further today. The structure of the panel, which we have an hour and a half. So unlike yesterday where we were a bit rushed, we'll have lots of times for questions and answers today. Hannah from the UK will speak first, and she has 10 minutes because, of course, we haven't heard from her before. And then our other panelists who have spoken before yesterday have 5 minutes each. And then we will have a robust discussion period. I'll just introduce Hannah. She's the Director of Gender Action for Peace and Security. I won't say more about that because I'm sure she's going to tell us about that. It's a bit of a special arrangement in the UK, which is very interesting. But Hannah has worked with civil society organizations and the British government in the UK and in the Global South. She's focused on violence against women and girls domestically and worked for humanitarian and development NGOs, again in the UK and in the Global South. She spent some time with the British Embassy in Addis, where she worked on Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somaliland. So she's got lots of creds for Africa. And lived and worked for 6 years in Ethiopia, where she specialized in conflict, gender, human rights, community-based development, and economic empowerment. And she focused on conflict and gender in her master's degree at King's College in London. Hannah, welcome to sunny Ottawa. We could say that you brought the sort of UK weather with you, but we won't do that. Part of the, April is all spring flowers. This is a result of, this is all the UK's fault because they, that's where the myths are, and I'm sure that the flowers are out in London. That doesn't happen in Canada until much later. Anyway, with all of that, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks also to the WPS network. It's a real pleasure to be here. Tony alluded to the fact that GAPS has quite a long-standing relationship with the British government. So we were established 11 years ago as the UK's version of the WPS Canada network. We work very closely with the British government and the UK Parliament, and I often refer to us as their critical friend. And what I'm about to say comes from our work on all 3 UK NAPs and the upcoming 4th NAP, which will be launched in January next year. So we have quite a lot of experience on working with national action plans. So for us, there are 5 key lessons learned on national action plans. Planning and policy directive, national capacity, resourcing, monitoring and evaluation and accountability, and civil society. So in terms of planning and policy directive, we've learned a huge amount here, particularly in the last 3 years. So for us, the pillars have just not worked, having a pillar approach. And that's because, as you all know, pillars overlap. You don't want a violence against women programme that doesn't have women's participation in it. It will never work. So the UK is moving to an objective results-based framework that is much more along thematic lines, as we started to discuss yesterday. But what we have learned is that you do have to work across all of the pillars. So the UK, particularly in recent years, has had quite a strong focus on sexual violence in conflict. But if you're going to genuinely work on women, peace and security, you need to work, of course, across all of the pillars. What we've also learned is that having a retrofitting NAP doesn't work. So the UK's NAP at the moment is essentially almost a stop in time. At a point in 2014 when it was being drafted, the NAP is an outline of all of that programming. But of course, things have changed a lot since 2014. So it doesn't allow for new programming, new policy that has been updated since then. It doesn't include things like, it speaks about refugees, but not to the extent that the UK, Europe and the world is dealing with refugees now, and of course, refugees themselves. So really, the UK NAP is now looking to be a visionary document that is very forward-looking. That means that anybody could pick it up, whether you're a conflict advisor in South Sudan or a humanitarian advisor in Syria. You could pick it up, read it, and know roughly what you're meant to do with it. So we've learned a huge amount about that. We've also learned that agreeing the departments up front and their level of engagement is really important. So in the UK, we have Foreign Affairs, Defence and Development ministries that are involved in the NAP. But what we don't have is, for example, Home Affairs or Justice, who either do work internationally but also have a role and responsibility for women who've experienced conflict who are in the UK or have come to the UK. We've also learned that there's a gap in commitments, and I'm pretty sure that applies globally. So the UK has just started, along with some work with us, to undertake an analysis of all of the commitments made in the Security Council resolutions, in policies, in events since then, to look at where the gaps are. And I feel personally like that analysis is a really important foundation for any national action plan. You need to know what you've committed to before you decide what you're going to do. And the other thing we've learned is that a living document is really important. So the UK NAPs say that they're a living document, but we need to find a way in which we can really update that as things change, as there are new policies, potentially new governments. So the second is national capacity. So I define that as intra-departmental, so across departments, and intra-departmental, so within government departments. So when we're talking across departments, what we have found is it's really important to have a joint national action plan, and that the implementation plans that are linked to that are also joint. For us, that has been really important. But also that document is public. So I know, for example, in the US, the implementation plans aren't all public. For us, it's been really important that they're public so that they can be monitored and that there's strong accountability. But also in terms of interdepartmental coordination, we have found that bi-weekly meetings of the government departments involved have been really important, and we as GAPS join one of those meetings a month. So there's 2 a month, we join one of them a month. Then in terms of intra-departmental, for us, having dedicated resources in every government department has been absolutely essential. And we've seen, for example, in the Ministry of Defence, that having dedicated people has really pushed that forward. Training has also been really important. So the UK now has 2 levels of training. All government departments are allowed to join that training. And what that has meant is that Women, Peace and Security gets outside of the usual suspects. It gets outside of the people in this room. And it means that people who are, say, conflict advisors, humanitarian advisors, can join that training and then start to learn how they can apply that in their own work. What we would like to see as GAPS is that then linked to performance appraisals. That's not happening in the UK yet, but we feel in terms of lessons learned that that's something that would be really important. But what has happened, the UK has 6 focus countries. And what has happened is that there's now a point person in every mission that the UK has for women, on those 6 countries on women, peace and security. And that basically means that emails on women, peace and security don't go into some sort of abyss, but there's somebody whose responsibility it is to deal with those and reply to them. We've also learned that having senior buy-in is essential. So we have a minister who's dedicated for women, peace and security. She has other responsibilities, but that's been really important. And also in our Ministry of Defence, like yours, our Vice Chief of Defence Staff has really, really driven this forward. So the overarching learning from that for us is that having an objective and a section on your NAP, on national capacity is vital. So the third area is on resourcing, and I've spoken a bit about human resources already. So here really, I'm going to speak about budgets. So there are 3 areas, I think, in which you need a budget just for your NAP, not necessarily for women, peace and security. And that's for staffing, for consultation and monitoring and evaluation. And that's really, I think, the basics. In our NAP, the amounts of money attached to those aren't necessarily outlined. They're only outlined for an evaluation. But something that we have learned, it may not be acted on, but is that that's really important. Also, of course, a budget for women, peace and security. You know, the UK doesn't have that, but we have learned through our work globally and within the UK that that's really important. But linked to that, what we have really learned is that tracking is vital. And it was really good to hear that in Canada you're looking at a tracking system. We, in the last NAP, worked with the British government who were establishing a new fund to get them to start to track women, peace and security spend just within that fund. And of course, what we learned is it's not much, right? But what, as a result, happened of that is that in the second year of that funding, they gave an uplift to women, peace and security. And of course, you know, what we know is often if you don't track, it doesn't happen. So for us, that has been really important and a massive learning. Fourthly, under monitoring, evaluation, accountability, for the first time ever, the National Action Plan has outlined that there is a budget for women, peace and security. For a women, peace and security, a NAP evaluation. Slightly distracted. He'll learn one day. He will learn one day that boys won't rule the world. So we have now outlined in the NAP a budget for an evaluation. It's the first time ever, and that for us has been really important. But on to monitoring, what we have learned is that a monitoring plan has to be established at the beginning. If you do it afterwards, it becomes really, really difficult. So what I would say is at the beginning, you really need to know what you're going to monitor in terms of outcomes, outputs, and inputs. You need an annual reporting mechanism. So our annual reporting mechanism is quite well established now. The British government report to Parliament once a year. They then, there's an event which we organise with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Women, Peace and Security, where the government delivers its report. So 3 ministers attend, one from each of the departments. They deliver their report. I present on the shadow report, and then NGOs and parliamentarians are able to question the government representatives on their progress. So for us, that has been a really important step. But what has been difficult, particularly for our government colleagues, is because the monitoring plan wasn't established at the beginning, they're going back and having to collate that data, ask different people for different pieces of data every time, and that's been difficult for them. Whereas now what we're looking at is establishing that monitoring at the beginning, because these things exist. You know, the government is analysing what it's achieving in terms of its development spend, etc., all the time anyway. So it's just about having a system in which to collate that. And linked to that, what we have learned is that narrative reports just don't work. They're long, nobody reads them, they're anecdotal. I mean, frankly, you could ask anybody really who's doing a terrible job to provide you an annual report and then to give you a great one if it's a narrative. So we really feel that you need a combination. You need good case studies, you sometimes need bad case studies, but you need a lot of data in there so that people can track, and you yourself can track what's going well, what's not going well. So as I said, we have our first ever funded evaluation. What I think is really key about that, again, before the NAP is launched, is agreeing, is this evaluation going to assess your women, peace and security work, or your NAP, or both? And that for us has been really important. And in the UK, that was done retrospectively and made it really difficult. We worked quite closely with the consultants to try to outline how that could then be assessed once the NAP had already been launched. So, for example, the indicators in our NAP are draft. And one of them is increased prosecutions for sexual violence in conflict. That's a massive ask in a 3-year NAP. So trying to work on that in advance so that the evaluators know what they're evaluating and how they're going to do that is important. So therefore, including the objectives, the baselines, the targets within the NAP, we have learned is really essential before you get going. And then lastly, on civil society. For us, one of our biggest successes is that we have worked collaboratively. That doesn't mean that we necessarily always agree, but it means that we always have the conversation and that conversation is always open. So I would really say, particularly to government colleagues, use your Women, Peace and Security network, really look at them as a resource, but also appreciate that they are your critical friend. They will be critical. But on top of that it doesn't come for free. So, for example, my post is funded. This work takes a huge amount of work, just as anybody's job does. And, appreciating that needs to be funded, I think, is really important. Also, under civil society, we've learned the importance of consultation. So both consultation like this, but also consultation in conflict-affected countries. So for the first time for the upcoming UK NAP, we've received a £60,000 grant for consultations in 3 of the 6 focus countries. We've managed with some of our members, Amnesty and WILP, who have funded an additional consultation in Syria, but that has meant that voices of women affected by conflict is the foundation of the next UK NAP. And for us, we really believe that that is essential. And as a bit of a plug, if you look on our website, we're going to have some videos that sort of give short examples of that. And we'd be happy to share the reports that my colleagues and my maternity cover, I can't take the credit for this, have worked really closely on. And finally, under civil society, the UK doesn't do this. But of course, we spoke about this a lot yesterday, the importance of funding women's rights organisations. If we don't do that, we're really not supporting the people who are at the front line and ensuring that that support is long-term and core. Because if it's not long-term and core, you end up with directors who all day, every day are applying for funding, who aren't getting down and doing the work and the important work that they do. So, I'll hand back over now, but I'm sure we'll have some longer discussion afterwards. But that's the learning that we have had, and we feel that, we're not going to get there yet. The next UK NAP, I'm sure, won't be my ideal NAP, but we're getting there, and this is a process in which we have learned a lot and that all of us are learning together in the UK.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Actually, the weather in Canada is getting better. Could you stay? That's a very, very complete covering of the UK plan and lots of very interesting points there. Many which we have been looking at, and some new ones as well. So thank you very much for that. Now, I'll turn to Jackie as our next speaker. I don't need to introduce her because she was introduced yesterday. Suffice it to say that she is eminently well qualified to speak to the issue of national action plans. And I do recall, I don't know whether it was Beth brought this to my attention at one point, that there's a lot of activity on naps. At one point it was the sort of flavor of the day, and the issue was, or the quote was, have we gone from naps to napping? Which I think is, which maybe you've heard before, but it's an interesting perspective. Jackie, please.
First, I just gotta say I'm really amazed by Hannah. She just gave 10 minutes on women, peace, and security with her screaming newborn in the background, and I think this is a woman having it all right now, and I'm just really amazed and impressed. Okay, I'm gonna go quickly and wanna highlight some of the things that Hannah found as well, and try to add some additional elements to it. So, big picture, as Mavic mentioned yesterday, there are now about 64 national action plans in existence. That means about a third of countries in the world have them. There's a pretty reasonable mix of what we, for lack of a better term, would call global north or global south countries that have these national action plans. Important to note, several are on their second or third versions, and so what I want to try to do today is reflect some of the experiences that we've documented and understood from people's transition and how they've applied learning over various iterations. And what we've come up with as an organization, which has then been adopted by UN Women, is called the concept of what's called a high-impact NAP, a high-impact national action plan. It's based on about 10 years of research, 6 years working directly with governments and civil society to identify what are the elements that make national action plans most successful. Spoiler alert, right now, there's no one country that has a high-impact NAP by our definition. There are countries that score well in certain elements and certain areas over others, and I think that's really important to consider. So the question really should never be what country's NAP should we emulate, et cetera. It's what elements of NAPs and the experiences can we learn from. So to go quickly, we identified 4 elements of a high-impact national action plan. First one being inclusive design. inclusive, meaning consultations between government and civil society. Civil society in country like you're doing right now, and then as Hannah mentioned, with civil society, especially for countries that have national action plans that are outward oriented, with civil society in potential focus countries. That ensures the plan reflects a broad set of priorities. It ensures buy-in and commitment to the plan over time. There are also inclusive coordinating bodies and different ways of ensuring that civil society is engaged over time in the implementation of the National Action Plan. And that ranges, so the Netherlands, for example, its first iteration had about 64 non-government organizations, civil society organizations actually sign on to the NAP and carry specific obligations for implementation and commitments. So that's one end of the spectrum. Countries like Bosnia have developed MOU between government and civil society, where civil society commits to doing certain things, government commits to doing certain things as well. It's outside of the NAP, but it's an associated MOU. In various other countries, there's a steering committee for NAP implementation, and civil society often has one seat, rotates members. Then there's countries like the United States, where we're currently working on the National Action Plan, and there's no formal mechanism for civil society input. We've created a civil society working group, which includes dozens of members now, and we informally advise government, advocate, et cetera, but there's no official recognition of civil society's role in the governance or implementation of the National Action Plan. So that's point one, inclusive design. Second one, political will. You talked about it, Hannah, and I think it really can't be underestimated. It's essential to make sure what Beth was talking about yesterday, it's not seen as a side document, but that it's actually central to government policy, to security strategy. So that involves the obvious, the high-level political support that's visible and invisible. It also involves mid-level support and ensuring, as we were just talking about, that there are things related to performance evaluations, for example, and ensuring that at the operational level, there are positive incentives for ensuring that the National Action Plan is implemented. It also involves linkages to other national strategies as a way of ensuring political will. So making sure that the most important, most salient other national strategies are informing the National Action Plan, and that the National Action Plan is reflected in those in turn as well. So it's referenced. It's part of the conversation when we talk about strategies. And then another point on this one, which I think is often overlooked, is the importance of being able to narrate your plan. So you may have a log frame that's totally conceptually, analytically, logically correct. But if people can't walk out of the room and explain why we need a national action plan and what the point of it is, you lose political will. It dissipates immediately. So spend some time thinking and focusing on just narrating what it is and why it matters in very accessible terms. Third element of a high-impact NAP is a results-based design and a monitoring and evaluation plan. So some countries have this, Norway, Netherlands, Jordan, a number of others, Bosnia, but I would say too many don't. And I think that's one of the main reasons we haven't seen more impact in the shorter term for National Action Plan. So really start by answering, what is it that we want to achieve? What's the point of doing all this? And then work backwards. So often we start with activity, layering activities onto each other, and then putting a framework on top and calling it a plan. Start with a relatively simple set of answers. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? And then work backwards. Having relevant indicators goes without saying, and I liked your point yesterday, Colonel, about not having too many indicators. That's one of the most common things that we see from versions of, like a first version of a NAP to a second to the third, is a reduction in the number of indicators. So if you try to count everything, you'll end up counting nothing. If you have crappy reporting about tons of stuff, no one's going to read it, no one's going to take it seriously. Focus on a few things, actually track them, and track them well. Have baselines and targets. I loved yesterday that you said you were going to do that. That's spectacular. And embracing qualitative indicators. So that's another element that we've seen of transition over time, is a real, I'd say, growing sophistication of an ability to track indicators that are not just counting. So not just how many people, how many women were at a meeting, but what kind of topics or issues did women raise at that meeting, and what impact did that have on the conversation? Not just how many people were trained, but how were their capacities? What skills are they able to demonstrate afterwards? And we have a publication that we produce called What Matters Most. It's about monitoring and evaluation of NAPs, and it has an appendix of 200 sample indicators. So if anyone wants to look up illustrative indicators to give you ideas, et cetera, you could have a look at that. It's online. Regular, clear reporting, as Beth mentioned, predictable reporting, and that's actually in a way that tells a story. Did we improve or did we not? Not just there was a shift in numbers. I mean, that we all know that. And that also helps make sure that you're learning from your national action plan. So set up an M&E plan that enables you to be reflective. And some elements, strikingly, even in civil society, I think it's fine for some elements to be confidential or classified within the government, because if it leads to much more authentic reflection, I don't mind a small portion of it, at least, that's classified. And then fourthly, resources and financing, the fourth element of a high-impact national action plan. I know Mavic will go in more depth on that, so I'll not spend too much time, but three key elements. One is actually having a budget from the outset. Secondly, ensuring that the funding that is provided for in the budget is actually from a relatively sustainable source. So ensuring it's not from a one-time donor contribution or one fund or one budget line item, but that it's an amalgamation of diversified budget sources so that you're less vulnerable when there are changes to any one. And then thirdly, that civil society has access to some of the funds to implement the National Action Plan. Civil society in countries of focus and civil society here as well. I'm going to end with that and turn it to Mavic.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, indeed.
Excited to start.
You're making my job easy, yeah. Thank you very much, Jackie, and without further ado, indeed, Mavic, please, we'd be very pleased to hear your perspective.
Thank you. The beauty of speaking last is that I can just say ibid to all of my my two formidable colleagues have said. But so I'll just add some footnotes. So lessons learned. There are many. I'll start with the coordination architecture. This is very, very important. Which entity, which government entity coordinates the NAP? And the operative word there is coordination. Somehow, in a number of countries we work with, we observe that they mistake coordination as implementation. So they're the only ones responsible for implementation. So they do not reach out to other government ministries, let alone civil society. So it's coordination, not for you to take responsibility for all of the implementation. It's very important where the coordination agency is located or entity is located. One of our criticisms, and this is mainly for developing countries, is that the lead coordinator is usually the gender ministry. And we know that gender ministries in most parts of the world are the most under-resourced, understaffed, and a lot of times very low political clout. So political clout is very, very important. How can you call for how can you demand the whole of government approach or even call a director level meeting if the coordinating entity doesn't have that political clout? And of course, access to resources. Now, part of the coordinating mechanism, Jackie has already referred to it, and I believe Hannah as well. Who is there? Who is in the coordinating committee or steering committee? Who are represented and what level of representation? We have an experience in Guatemala, which we are supporting in their national action planning processes. So we're talking mostly, or UN Women convened mostly middle-level individuals in different ministries, and they said, oh, we're really committed to this process, but we're not the decision makers. So they were self-marginalizing, we thought. We're not the decision makers. And I say, yes, you're not the decision makers, but you have the ears of the decision makers. You can tell them what's important. You can tell them that this is the priority. So that's where I really look at the importance of who is in the middle in the government architecture. Because, okay, I'll go to another lesson learned and circle back to it. Changing leadership. What we've learned in a number of countries is when there's either an election or reshuffling in the cabinet, they don't necessarily own what was started by their predecessors. And in fact, in a number of countries, if the predecessor is coming from the opposition political party, they totally disregard it. We're not part of it. It's not our agenda. So it's a real challenge. And and we say top leadership, the politicians change, but the middle-level people are always there. They've been there for 10, 20 years and probably will stay for another 10 years. So it's important to get the support, to get those people fully on board. And then also on the coordinate, I'm only on point 1 of my notes. My goodness, and I have 2 minutes. Okay, still on the coordination architecture, civil society. We believe it's important to have a steering committee where there's a representation of civil society. So government and civil society sitting together with, Jackie referred to this already, sitting together. And again, self-selection of civil society, not the government pinpointing who should be the civil society representative. But it's equally important to have a separate civil society coordinating committee, because that's where you strategize. That's where you make a decision to come up with a unified position when you are in that government civil society steering committee. You cannot sit there and disagree and, Anyway, it's not very strategic. Funding, we cannot emphasize this enough. But one of the lessons learned is that there is often funding for development of the NAP because it's exciting, it's, the governments are beginning to show commitment, and then there's nothing for implementation. And that's where the napping comes. So I love to say from napping, National Action Planning, they go to sleeping. There's no fund for implementation. Monitoring and evaluation, we've done civil society monitoring for 5 years. It's blood, sweat, and tears to monitor. And I'm looking at Christine because she participated in the WPS, the network participated in civil society monitoring. Our main lesson learned here is simplify. Simplify, ensure that the indicators are applicable and acceptable. And this is the reason why the indicators, the international indicators or global indicators developed under Resolution 1889, which member states actually use them? Anyone who could hazard a guess? No one. 0. Because they are too technical, they are too complicated, and there's 26 of them, and then there are sub-indicators. Altogether, there's more than 50. And so they're not officially adopted. Because of that, member states are only looking at them as, in two perspectives. One, it's additional burden. Many member states are already complaining of too much reporting to the UN, which is true. And this is true for both developing and developed countries. The second, member states are looking at it as only a name and shame exercise. They're not who is not doing enough, who is not doing anything at all. So at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, we develop a scorecard, really a simplified way of monitoring and showing the progress. And we've developed this after, from our experience of 5-year experience from civil society monitoring. And then reporting. For government, I'm happy to hear that Canada is actually reporting to the Parliament, right, in the NAP implementation. But then there's also CEDAW. After the adoption of CEDAW, General Recommendation 30 on women in conflict prevention, I have to say this slowly, it's a mouthful. Women in conflict prevention, conflict, and post-conflict situation, all 189 states parties of CEDAW are required to report. And we've been to Geneva to monitor how they are using General Recommendation 30 for reporting, and it's the kind of monitoring and reporting that we would like to see in all governments and in New York. The CEDAW experts ask the government representatives, do you have a national action plan? Did civil society participate in the development and implementation of the National Action Plan? Do you have a monitoring mechanism? Do you have a dedicated budget? These are the kind of questions that we would like to see. So, and so far, 25 member states have already used CEDAW GR30 to report on their implementation of their NAPs. And I don't know when Canada last reported. Oh, just recently. So I haven't looked at the state report and the shadow reports, which are equally important. That's where civil society can integrate their monitoring. But it's good to always look at the concluding observations around the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for getting this discussion started. Once again, Mavic, there's a lot there, and clearly you've got a lot of experience to share with us, and in fact some new areas that we need to explore. I will take advantage of my position here as the monitor to ask perhaps the first question, one which we've been struggling with and we need some help with. I think we're very aware that many people look at NAPs, that they're one of two ways. There are NAPs by donor countries, such as most of, Canada and many others. And there are NAPs in conflict-affected countries. And I must admit that when I've been in the room with NAP coordinators from the latter, that is from conflict-affected countries, it's quite a humbling experience. They take their NAPs very seriously, and they're very inward-looking, of course. And they work with their civil society and their domestic agencies, home offices and justice departments and that sort of thing to mobilize women in assisting in their stabilization and reconciliation processes. That's very different from the sort of NAP that we're dealing with, which is very externally focused. In other words, how are we going to assist other countries, in some cases those countries, to mobilize women to assist in their reconciliation and conflict prevention processes. I'm getting to the point of my question here in a minute. There is comment amongst some of you, and we have listened to it very carefully, that perhaps there shouldn't be such a clear dividing line between externally focused NAPs by donor countries and internally focused NAPs by conflict-affected countries, and that a country like Canada could benefit by looking at some of our domestic issues and policies and procedures and including those in the NAP. We've not done that so far. I'd be very interested in hearing from the panel, and we did hear from the UK that yours is primarily outwardly focused, and I'd be interested to hear whether you've had this discussion at all, and from the others, the international perspective.
Thank you. So in the UK, we have had this discussion now probably since 2013. But before I say that, as far as I'm aware, the only two donor countries who are domesticating their NAP, as we call it, are Finland and Ireland. And I could be wrong about that, but that's as far as I'm aware. And Finland includes women who've been trafficked to Finland, and the civil servants who are responsible for trafficking sit in the coordination meetings. And in Ireland, I think that they have gone a step further, but I don't have a great deal of detail about the Irish NAP, but others may do so. In terms of the UK, we have really tried to ensure that particularly our Home Office is included, and that's, again, for women who have been trafficked to the UK from conflict-affected countries, but also refugees and asylum seekers. But in all honesty, we've found it very difficult. And I think that's basically because it would almost turn the system of the way in which the UK treats refugees and asylum seekers on its head. because we would have to look the government would have to look completely differently at the way in which it does it. So, for example, in the UK, we have a detention centre where failed asylum seekers are sent. You, of course, shouldn't be detaining women who have, by international law, who have experienced violence against women, yet we do still send people there. So it has been difficult. But the government is now looking at whether and how we should be bringing that discussion back up. So in the 2014 to 17 NAP, some of the Home Office officials attended the first few meetings, but then just dropped off. And I think that's because it is difficult, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Everything is difficult when you first start to do it, right? Like whatever you're doing. But you have to, these commitments have been made. So of course we should be doing that. But I think there's also a really important argument for the international sections of our police, our justice ministries, to also be included in the NAP. And I think it's really positive that the Royal Mountain Police are here and that are included in the NAP. And I would really hope that the UK at least looks to doing that, but more importantly also looks at domesticating the NAP for women who have entered the UK and experienced conflict. And sorry, one more point. The UK has also experienced conflict ourselves. Northern Ireland has been a conflict for many, many years. The UK government don't consider it a conflict because they would, for many reasons, basically. But that means that the principles of 1325 have not been applied to Northern Ireland, and as a result, Northern Irish women's representation in the peace agreement, women had to set up a separate political party to get a seat at the table. Nothing that has been in 1325 has applied to them, although of course it should do.
The advantages of having someone from outside government explain this, so that's very frank of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge for most developed countries in terms of implementation domestically. I think some of the good efforts, I'm saying efforts because it's continuing, we cannot identify them yet as best practice examples. In the Netherlands, the National Action Plan is co-signed by civil society, more than 40 or close to 50 civil society. They're not just participating in consultation. They are co-signatories along with the department, with the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of Education and Culture, I believe. So how does that translate into the domestication? A number of those civil society are organizations from the diaspora, which extends to the refugees in that country. And I think that's how they are really generating ownership. In Northern Ireland, Hannah mentioned Northern Ireland. I was actually invited last year by the local council there because they are looking at localizing 1325. And for I think in a great way for the same reason that the UK NAP is not really addressing their context. And the mayor was in our workshop on localization, and they are in the process of deliberating within the council on how and what shape and form would they be able to integrate it in their own development plans. And in Japan, what they have done to promote domestication or local ownership is they have intersected it in their disaster response. As we all know, it's prone to natural disasters. So, what is the intersection of disaster with peace and security, and knowing that they're what's the equivalent? They don't have a military. I'm blanking on the name, but the forces, the police forces, are also the first respondents to natural disasters. So that's their way of promoting domestic ownership. In the U.S., I don't know what could be accomplished under the new order, but what we've been discussing with civil society groups that have been closely monitoring the National Action Plan is look at the model of CEDAW cities. We know the U.S. is one of 5 countries that have not adopted or ratified CEDAW, but in cities and towns, there's a lot of interest from mayors and other local officials to implement CEDAW. So there is now a strategy that's called CEDAW City. San Francisco, for example, is considered a CEDAW city. So that's how they are localizing a response to an international law. And it's something that I would love to discuss with Jackie and other colleagues in the U.S. later. And it's also probably another approach that you can consider. CEDAW City, NAP cities, 1325 cities in Canada would be great to see.
Thanks for putting the question just right on the agenda, and I hope others in the room will also respond to it, because it's a really tough one, and I don't honestly know exactly where I land on it. I know that ideally we'd all have both internally and externally focused NAPs, and I think it would go a long way towards reducing real and perceived hypocrisy of various countries, and it would also lead to really authentic and genuine reflection. So I think, should a NAP be inwardly focused as well? Yes. What's the reality of the machinery of institutions that need to implement it and that realistically are going to be implementing it? As you mentioned, they're just not necessarily set up to be interacting or doing any kind of joint planning, monitoring, evaluation in that way. So the reality is striking, and it's not irrelevant. That said, I think there's also only so much you can do to implement your NAP without some internal focus. So we can't be saying we need to be deploying more female RCMP officers if we're not changing recruiting practices as well, if we're not changing the internal culture of organizations so that women are retained and seek external opportunities. We can't say, I think the U.S. or the Canadian example of Operation Honor is really important, and one of the reasons I'm a big fan of General Vance is he actually proclaims to understand the connections between the two, that you can't have, you can't go from saying you can treat your fellow member of the service in a totally dismissive and derogatory way, and then have respect for women in the community that you're in the theater of operation in which you're working, and view her as a powerful agent of change. These things are related. Those who dismiss force culture internally are the most, as he says, useless on the battlefield anyway. So they're related. You have to look internally, but again, the planning and the operation, I'm just not sure can happen. And this was a big debate within the United States as well about the creation of the National Action Plan. It was absolutely a no-go for the U.S. to develop a NAP that would have had any internal element, including anything related to sexual abuse in the U.S. military. Huge, enormous, massive problem, and it was a complete no-go. There would have been no U.S. National Action Plan. So we as civil society made a calculation, and not all of us agreed on it at all. A lot of internal dissent about whether or not we'd accept that and say the U.S. Is going to be working on force, security, cooperation, capacity building of external forces without looking internally on doing that. And that's hypocritical, and that's a problem. Again, whether or not how you marry that with political realities is a tough situation. And final point, I do think, as I said yesterday, that I think a lot of the new issues that are evolving and being addressed by NAPs are going to significantly blur the lines between this totally outwardly focused and totally inwardly focused. And I'll give the example of the U.S. Border security right now is a huge, big issue, as you know extremely well here in Canada. And Homeland Security was in no way involved in the U.S. National Action Plan. They'd send a representative from time to time. Now it's a big thing, because this connection between domestic and international is much more prevalent and vivid in people's minds. Far more people who work at the State Department have a domestic attention or focus than they used to. And so I think we're going to see these lines being blurred. Whether or not we can accelerate it, I'm just not sure. Or how quickly we can accelerate it, I'm not sure.
Good. Thank you very much. Clearly, a dichotomy between what might be an ideal situation and the practicality. And if I can just make one comment, and it relates to the question of reporting, which a couple of you have mentioned, and it's been mentioned to me that NAP countries sometimes feel reporting fatigue. And so we work quite hard at producing a report, an annual report, or have done so in the last NAP. It never gets out early enough, but that's all right. It does get out and tabled in Parliament, indeed. And we work quite hard at that. And then all these organizations to which we belong come to us and say, well, send us, your report. And we've kind of mentioned that. And they all have their own formats and what they want to report on. And here, for example, the UN, we've just mentioned, NATO asks us for the same sort of thing. I say same, different sorts of things. And the OSCE asks us every year for something, and on it goes. And sometimes there are other organizations that do it well. We're tempted to say, well, go and read our report. We table this, that's why we wrote it. All our information is there. And their answer, of course, is take the UN, for example. They have 190 countries, and they don't have the time to dissect the various reports, or even from the NAP countries, which is now some 60, they don't have the time to dissect from 60 different reports as to the information they need, so they ask us to do that for them, and we try to do so. It's mildly annoying that all you get out of this work in the UN is a footnote. Canada responded to our request. That's all you get. You might get, if there's something clever in there, something cited as an example. But so it is a question, and it's related to the issue of domesticating. I like that word, or localizing or domesticating your NAP, because Canada, for example, and all of our countries are. We have separate reporting regimes for these sorts of things, and we're accountable in Geneva for some of these issues. And it, in some ways, would be a duplication of effort. That's not a defensive, it's not supposed to be a defensive comment by me about the government, but it is a challenge for us as to how we would handle this. Thank you very much for those remarks and for answering my question, and I would now open it up.